So everything above 10%, which was due to kick in early July. If countries don't get their trade deal sorted with the US, is he going to extend that deadline? Or basically, are we going to have an even bigger gulf between what the UK has access to and what everyone else has to deal with going into the US market?
Canada will rescind a tax on big US technology firms just hours before the first payments were due to allow trade talks between both the US and Canada to start. On Friday, the US President Donald Trump called off negotiations over a trade deal, describing the tax as a blatant attack and threatened higher tariffs on imports from Canada. Domestically, though, the deal to cut import tariffs between the US and UK has come into force today, giving British car makers preferential access to the world's biggest consumer market. Let's get up to date with all this with Allie Renison, former government advisor on business and trade and associate director of SEC Newgate. Hi, Allie.
Good evening.
Thank you so much for being with us. Let's just talk about the US-UK trade deal that comes into force today. Of course, it is good news for UK motor manufacturers. They can sell up to 100,000 vehicles to the US at a tariff of 10%. That gives them a huge advantage over international competitors. And I wonder whether, in the short term, at least, the UK will be able to benefit from that, and by how much?
Well, I think it depends on what you're looking at for your timescale. So obviously at the moment, the UK has a preferential advantage in terms of its access into the US market, as you say. Everyone else is looking at 25%, in some cases more. At the moment, the UK now has a sort of reduced 10% sort of tariff. Now, currently, that's pro rata. So effectively, that means that the 100,000 sort of quota, which means that, up to 100,000 cars from the UK can be sent to the US duty free. But obviously, we're halfway through the year. So right now, for the rest of 2025, that's about 62,000. Having said that, it's still a lot of certainty, I think, for the big sort of particularly luxury motor manufacturers in the UK. Big question marks over when the additional tariffs that were suspended by Donald Trump from Liberation Day, so everything above 10%, which was due to kick in early July. If countries don't get their trade deal sorted with the US, is he going to extend that deadline? Or basically, are we going to have an even bigger gulf between what the UK has access to and what everyone else has to deal with going into the US market?
Yeah, so the issue now is UK steel and aluminium. They remain on a 25% tariff, don't they? That could double to 50% if the UK and US don't reach a deal by the deadline of the 9th of July, which is just around the corner. I mean, this is no doubt causing a lot of anxiety amongst steel producers, particularly here in the UK. What is going to be going on behind the scenes to get that across the line in time?
So effectively, the US and the UK made an agreement to, along with sort of autos, to get preferential access compared to certainly what everyone else faces sending their steel exports into the United States market. But one of the issues at hand in terms of satisfying the US conditions is they want steel to be what they called melted and poured in the country that's trying to get these preferential reduced tariff rates into the US. And that basically means that whether you're Tata Steel or other steel producers, if you've got component parts going into the steel that are coming from, let's say, India or other parts of the world, that they aren't particularly happy about the fact that some of your steel is actually being sourced from other countries in terms of the inputs. Now, the UK's argument is that effectively we make really niche products here. It's not like competing with the US in terms of Chinese cheap slab metal from the Chinese market. And so because of this sort of niche kind of producers that are sending stuff to the US, that we shouldn't be looked at the same. So there's a big question about whether we can satisfy US conditions in time for July 9th. But I think some of the industry is fairly hopeful that there will be a deal struck by early July.
Yeah, well, they'll have to be as we're marching on into the month of July already. UK aerospace exports have been cut to zero. Does this encompass everything, Allie? Are there things that we export to the US which haven't been considered so far, or does this generally wrap everything up apart from those specifics on cars and on steel, etc.?
Well, in fact, if you look at what was the outline framework agreement that was struck between the US and the UK, effectively what's coming into effect today and what's still being negotiated, there's a big gulf between it. So we've got a couple of headline commitments that have come into effect early, but the US and the UK are still negotiating on a lot of other things. Some of the things that were mentioned in that outline framework deal were preferential access whenever the US sort of starts putting tariffs on, for example, pharmaceutical exports. We know some of those investigations are happening now. And I think the government would probably argue that this is a win for its new trade strategy approach, which says we're going to try and not put everything in the free trade deal basket. Those things can take a long time. We're going to try and do it piece by piece. And that's what I think you're seeing coming into effect today.
And there are concerns, aren't there, from British farmers? The UK is going to scrap tariffs on beef and US ethanol imports. A move which the British bioethanol industry says will make it impossible to compete. I wonder if there are any concessions or will have any concessions from UK governments to try and sort of allay some of the fears by British farmers that this, could open the door to beef from cattle raised using hormones to boost their growth, for example.
So it's interesting, if you look at the outline framework agreement from about 6 weeks ago, actually, there was a very clear reference to saying we are not going to import sort of basically products in the agricultural market in beef that don't meet our own sort of domestic food production, food safety rules. So effectively what that is about increasing the quota for trade in non-hormone treated beef. However, as you say, there is some concern from UK farmers about the fact that US soya farmers, that they now have a quota of increased sort of duty-free access to the UK market. And a lot of farmers will actually, when it comes to their wheat production, that goes into sourcing for certain plants to deal with things like green fuel as an alternative means of engine production for gas, effectively. So when you look at that, that is really about sort of saying, what are the issues here? Is this about the fact that, the US trade deal is going to make the UK bioethanol industry uncompetitive? Well, yes and no. Effectively, when you look at what's happened before, those ethanol plants in the UK have been struggling for a while. We know that the UK government is in talks with them on government funding and to change some Department for Transport rules. So I think that to some extent, they may be sort of leveraging the US talks to say, come on, we need to sort of make a resolution in terms of the support that we need from the UK right now.
And look, trade talks have been particularly vicious between the US and Canada, but now Mark Carney, the Prime Minister of Canada, scrapped their digital services tax on US technology companies. So as far as we understand it, they're going to start negotiations again, try and agree a deal between both countries by the 21st of July. But I know that there was a lot of reporting on this over the weekend, Allie.
Yeah, it's fascinating because the UK has a digital services tax. The US doesn't like it. The US even said in its sort of communications around the US-UK outline trade deal framework that it was disappointed that the UK didn't move, but Canada seems to have moved to try and get the trade talks off the ground. And I think it just goes to show that sometimes there's not always a lot of rational consistency in the way that Trump does his trade negotiations. It probably also helps that the UK government sort of committed to buying Boeing planes in exchange for sort of sending Rolls-Royce engines. So again, I think we're in an era of where when it comes to trade negotiations, there's a lot of different moving parts and it's hard to predict consistency across different trading partner trade deal talks.
Allie, always great to speak to you. Thank you. Allie Renison, former government advisor on business and trade and associate director of SEC Newgate.